One of the most consequential trade relationships in the modern world is under serious structural stress. The economic partnership between the United States and Canada, built over 75 years, deepened by NAFTA and reinforced by USMCA, is being tested in ways that will shape supply chains, consumer prices, energy markets, and global trade architecture for decades to come. This is not media spin. It is not political commentary dressed up as analysis. It is a story told through documented data, official filings, government reports, and trade statistics that most people have not read, but that explain what is actually happening beneath the headlines. So if you have been following the surface-level coverage, tariffs, retaliatory measures, Carney soundbites, Trump Truth Social posts, this breakdown is about the layer underneath all of that. The structural shift in how Canada is repositioning itself in the global economy, the genuine early results of that repositioning, the limitations that honest analysts are not willing to gloss over, and the broader question of what a durable fracture in North American trade integration actually means for both sides of the border. To understand the scale of what is at stake, start with what the relationship actually was before the trade war ignited. The trilateral merchandise trade governed by CUSMA reached $1.9 trillion in 2023, a 30% increase since the agreement entered into force, encompassing a market of more than 460 million people across 3 economies. The integration ran deeper than simple buying and selling. In the automotive sector alone, components for a single vehicle could cross the U.S. Canada border multiple times during production. Engines, transmissions, stampings, and electrical systems moving back and forth between Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Ontario before the finished product rolled off the line. That was not a trade relationship. That was a shared manufacturing infrastructure operating across an international boundary. Canada sent approximately 76% of its total exports to the United States in 2025, $495.2 billion Canadian dollars, making the U.S. the destination for more than 3/4 of everything Canada ships abroad. On the American side, Canada was the largest export market for American goods, not China, not the European Union, not Japan. American farmers, steelworkers, auto parts manufacturers, and energy companies all depended on Canadian demand in ways that were often invisible to domestic political audiences. Then Donald Trump reached for the tariff lever. On February 1st, 2025, the administration imposed 25% tariffs on most Canadian goods, 10% on Canadian energy exports, and 50% on Canadian steel and aluminum. Additional duties followed across the year on copper, softwood lumber, heavy-duty trucks, and automotive components. In March 2025, Trump announced 25% tariffs on all imported vehicles and auto parts, a measure that did not surgically cut the Canadian auto sector. It raised the cost of every vehicle assembled in North America because the supply chains cannot be separated. The Canadian part becomes the American car, becomes the American consumer's higher monthly payment. Canada's response was proportionate and escalating. Ottawa announced $30 billion in retaliatory tariffs on American goods, with a credible threat to expand to $155 billion if Washington did not reverse course. Washington did not reverse course. Provincial governments launched their own responses, with Ontario's LCBO removing American alcohol from shelves and Quebec following. What made this moment historically significant was not just the economic numbers. It was the language Carney used to describe what had happened. Standing before cameras, he said the old relationship with the United States, based on deepening economic integration and close security cooperation, was over. Not strained, not under pressure, over. That was the declaration. Now let's talk about what Canada has actually done since making it, because that is where the real story lives, and where honest analysis requires distinguishing between genuine early results and aspirational framing. Carney's first foreign trips as Prime Minister went to Paris and London, rather than Washington. The signal was deliberate. He was communicating to both domestic and international audiences that Canada's diplomatic priorities had shifted. Standing alongside French President Macron, he called for deeper trade and security integration between Canada and the democratic nations of Europe. He wrote an op-ed in The Economist arguing for what he called creative docking arrangements between major trading blocs, a framework for building economic resilience among like-minded nations outside the gravitational pull of the two great powers. On November 20th, 2025, in Melbourne, Australia, EU Trade Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič formally launched the inaugural EU CPTPP trade and investment dialogue alongside his 12 counterparts from the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership Nations. The dialogue covers 5 areas: trade diversification, digital trade, trade and investment facilitation, supply chain resilience, and WTO reform. Together, the EU and CPTPP represent 32% of global GDP and 37% of global trade. That number, 32% of global GDP, is the real figure. It is significant. But it requires an important caveat that the dramatized version consistently omits. This is a dialogue framework, not a unified trade bloc. Analysts at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada who watched the Melbourne summit closely noted that the docking of trade blocs that Carney and EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen had called for was left to another day. Instead, the inaugural meetings produced joint statements affirming support for the WTO and calling for closer cooperation on digital trade and supply chains, with more concrete actions kicked down the road. The architecture is real. The framework is being built, but it is in early construction, not operational. The next significant step came at the WTO's 14th Ministerial Conference in Yaoundé, Cameroon, in March 2026, where EU and CPTPP ministers agreed to accelerate work toward what Canada's trade minister called a historic digital trade agreement covering e-commerce, data flows, and storage. Analysts at the German Marshall Fund describe this as meaningful evidence that middle powers are no longer waiting for consensus to emerge in a fractured WTO. They are building it elsewhere, in areas like digital trade where overlapping interests make convergence achievable, without American or Chinese participation. A subsequent conference in Tokyo in May 2026 and a series of ongoing workshops are continuing the EU CPTPP engagement, supported by the Japan Economic Foundation, Swedish trade authorities, the Bertelsmann Stiftung, the UK, Australia, and Canada. This is institutional momentum, documented and verifiable. What it is not yet is a completed alternative global trade architecture. The honest framing is that the foundation is being poured, not that the building is standing. Now let's look at Canada's actual diversification results, because the data is more nuanced than either the cheerleaders or the skeptics are fully acknowledging. According to the Office of the Chief Economist at Global Affairs Canada, Canadian exports to non-US markets grew 8.3% year-to-date through September 2025, with notable increases to the United Kingdom, Germany, the Netherlands, China, and Singapore. Canada's overall goods and services exports were up slightly for the year, approximately 0.8%, meaning that non-US growth was partially but meaningfully offsetting losses in American market access. The sectoral picture is telling. Canadian energy exports to non-US markets rose 22.3% to $28.8 billion in 2025, driven by higher shipments to China, Hong Kong, and the Netherlands, with Singapore, Germany, and Italy also expanding. Canadian aluminum exports, heavily hit by American tariffs, grew from $738 million in 2024 to $2.1 billion in 2025, led by shipments to the Netherlands and Italy. Agricultural exports surged 60% to Europe, helping offset losses from U.S. tariffs on Canadian farm products. These are real numbers from Statistics Canada. The diversification is happening. The completion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion and the launch of the first LNG shipments from British Columbia in July 2025, with a second processing unit coming online in November, gave Canada the physical infrastructure to route energy toward Asian markets at a scale that was previously unavailable. That is structural change, not diplomatic rhetoric. But here is the honest limitation that serious analysts are not willing to paper over. Canada still sent roughly 75% of its merchandise exports to the United States in 2025, essentially unchanged from prior years. The diversification gains, while real, are at the margins of a relationship so deeply integrated that redirecting it meaningfully takes years, not months. Global affairs. Canada's own economists noted that while Canadian exports to non-U.S. markets have expanded enough to offset U.S. losses so far, the increase has been largely driven by gold. Going forward, it will remain a genuine challenge to find alternative markets for products traditionally engineered specifically for American supply chains. The automotive sector illustrates the constraint most clearly. With more than 90% of Canada's auto exports headed to the United States, the 25% tariff on vehicles has disrupted the sector in ways that cannot be quickly redirected. Automotive exports contracted 4.4% in 2025 and are expected to decline a further 1.1% in 2026. Slower electric vehicle demand led manufacturers to delay or scale back investments, idling production lines in Ontario. You do not replace the American auto market by selling Canadian-made SUVs to Japan. The supply chain integration that made the relationship so productive is the same integration that makes unwinding it so slow and painful. Now let's talk about the US dollar dimension, because this is where the story has genuine long-term significance, but also where it requires the most careful handling to avoid conflating early movement with arrived conclusions. The US dollar's status as the world's primary reserve currency is not guaranteed by law or treaty. It is maintained by the accumulated trust of global trading relationships, the depth of American financial markets, and the convention of denominating international commodity trade in dollars. When the CPTPP EU joint statement from the March 2026 WTO conference explicitly cited shared concerns about economic coercion that seeks to exploit economic vulnerabilities and dependencies, and committed to cooperation on digital trade standards and supply chain resilience, they were building institutional frameworks that, over time, could reduce the centrality of American financial infrastructure to global commerce. That shift is gradual and its endpoints are genuinely uncertain. The dollar does not get displaced by a communiqué, but the pattern of middle powers deliberately constructing trade architecture, investment frameworks, and digital trade rules outside of American-led processes is a documented development, not a speculative one. The EU has over the past year concluded trade negotiations with Australia, India, and Indonesia, with a Mercosur deal expected to enter into force in May 2026. Deals with Malaysia and the Philippines are in the pipeline. The logic in each case is consistent: diversify partnerships, anchor rules with like-minded economies, and reduce vulnerability to geopolitical risk from either Washington or Beijing. Canada's F-35 situation adds the defense dimension that makes this more than a purely commercial story. Carney's government did place the planned F-35 purchase under formal review, a real signal to Washington that even defense procurement was not insulated from the broader deterioration of the relationship. Canada simultaneously deepened engagement with European defense partners and the EU's RIRM framework. When a NATO ally and Five Eyes intelligence partner begins formally questioning whether American defense hardware is its best investment, the implications extend beyond the dollar value of the contract. It tells every other American ally watching the situation that assumptions about the permanence of American defense relationships cannot be taken for granted. Now let's look at the Smoot-Hawley historical parallel, because it is genuinely instructive and also genuinely limited. global merchandise trade volumes actually rose 4.4% in 2025, despite rising protectionism and new tariffs across multiple major economies, outpacing the 2.2% increase recorded in 2024. The world has not fractured the way it did after 1930. Trade flows have rerouted and adjusted more rapidly than in the Depression era, precisely because modern supply chains are more flexible and the WTO-based rules framework, however strained, has provided more institutional cushioning than existed in 1930. What the Smoot-Hawley parallel does capture accurately is the psychological dynamic, the way that trade wars damage trust between partners in ways that outlast the specific tariff measures themselves. Non-U.S. Canadian exports grew 13.6% in 2025, indicating that the diversification impulse triggered by American tariff pressure has produced real early results in Asian, European, and other markets. That reorientation is partly driven by opportunity and partly driven by something harder to reverse. The conclusion inside Canadian government and business circles that the American relationship can no longer be treated as a stable, unconditional foundation for economic planning. That psychological shift does not evaporate when tariffs are eventually adjusted. It persists in procurement decisions, infrastructure investments, diplomatic priorities, and the long-term allocation of Canadian economic energy. Here is what investors and serious financial analysts are actually tracking as this situation develops, without the dramatic framing. Canadian energy sector equities and critical minerals producers are attracting fresh international attention as Canada positions itself as a key supplier to markets outside the United States, particularly given its new LNG export capacity and its position as a significant holder of the lithium, cobalt, and rare earth minerals that the global energy transition requires. American export-heavy sectors with significant Canadian revenue exposure, agricultural processors, auto parts manufacturers, industrial equipment producers, face genuine headwinds that their earnings guidance over the next 4 to 6 quarters will quantify more precisely than any political commentary can. The CUSMA review deadline of July 1st is a contractual trigger, not a negotiating cliff, but the extended uncertainty of annual review status, should comprehensive renegotiation fail, creates persistent planning difficulties for the businesses on both sides whose supply chains assume the agreement's stability. The conclusions that emerge from looking at all of this honestly are less cinematic than the dramatized version, but more consequential for being accurate. The United States has imposed aggressive tariffs on its single largest export market. Canada has responded with retaliatory measures, a genuine diplomatic pivot toward Europe and the Indo-Pacific, and real early results in non-U.S. export growth that the data confirms, while still sending 3/4 of its merchandise exports to America, because that integration cannot be unwound quickly. A multilateral framework connecting the EU and CPTPP, covering 32% of global GDP and 37% of global trade, is being actively constructed through documented diplomatic processes, with a digital trade agreement emerging as the first concrete deliverable. It is early-stage architecture, not a completed building, but the construction is underway, and the blueprints are being developed with or without American participation. As one analyst put it, middle power coalitions are no longer waiting for consensus to emerge. They are building it elsewhere. Whether that building ultimately produces a durable alternative to American-centered trade architecture, or whether a CUSMA renegotiation restores enough stability to slow the pivot before it becomes irreversible, is the genuinely open question at the center of this story. The data does not yet answer it, but it tells you clearly that the question is real, the stakes are documented, and the window for Washington to shape the answer on its own terms is narrowing with every week that passes without a comprehensive framework agreement. That is the full picture. No invented coalitions, No fabricated reactions, no dramatic verdicts. The evidence has not yet delivered. Just a structural shift in North American economic relations that is large enough, documented enough, and consequential enough to follow carefully. Because where it lands will matter for a long time.